much. Took us about 24 minutes to figure this out.
It did.
But I'm incredibly proud, and thank you so much for your patience in getting all of this to work for us. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you feeling? The book comes out in exactly a day, officially.
I know. Well, it's coming out on Thursday here. But things have been busy as people started reading it, reading proofs and responding. So it sort of feels like it's already happened, but it officially lands on Thursday.
Yeah. I definitely want to talk more about the book, but before I get to the book itself, I have a general question that I usually ask everybody who has written more than one book. How have you changed, you as an author, from the first time you published and now?
Well, this is my fifth book. So I think that in the 20 years since I published my first book, I probably just changed as a person. I had children, I got married, I, became an adult. So lots of life changes. I would say as a writer, definitely I've gone through different kinds of evolutions as a writer. I would say this is probably my most kind of formally experimental novel. So I think stylistically things have shifted. It's typical that as one gets older, one writes shorter books. And so I think that's definitely true in this case. But I feel bolder in terms of style and in terms of the themes I'm willing to take on. So that's kind of nice, and we'll see what happens.
It's so we were talking about growing as a writer, growing as a thinker, especially the ways in which we see the world as it keeps so rapidly changing around us. How much of the darkness, I would say, that is surrounding us in our contemporary moment, how much of that influenced your thinking as you were envisioning this book before you even put pen down to writing? I was curious because, as you said, you moved away from earlier thematic explorations of your work and embracing more of the complexities and nuances. And I would also want to say a lot of violence in this specific case. So how much of our contemporary world influenced a lot of your thinking?
Yeah.
Did it at all?
And for me, certainly I was feeling a tremendous amount of anger, specifically about the ways in which women's rights and our sort of like our campaign, our sort of generations long campaign for equality has been stalled or is taking a giant step backwards. And this is a confluence of the rise of the right wing all over the world, techno-fascism, which is basically, technology enabled forms of engagement, a kind of backlash against Me Too, spaces in which men feel emboldened to represent certain values that frankly maybe they were like too ashamed to represent 10 or 20 years ago. So all of those things are very much on my mind. I'm a lifelong feminist. I'm a daughter of feminists. So I feel very, very disappointed and upset at the state of the world. And any book that I'm going to write in this mood is going to reflect that.
Tell us more about Uprising. Why the title? How did the idea come to you? Talk to me about the origin story.
So as I'm speaking to you and you're in Bangladesh, this is a very different conversation than the one I have with people outside of Bangladesh. So as you and I both know, prostitution is legal in Bangladesh, and there are many state licensed brothels in the country. Bani Shanta, which is an island brothel, just about a 20-minute boat ride from Bangla, is one of those. It has been a state licensed brothel since before Bangladesh was born. Since I don't know, maybe even colonial times, or I'm not, my history isn't 100% clear on this, so don't quote me. It's been a state licensed brothel for a long time. I came to know about Bani Shanta about 15 years ago when I went on a trip to Sundarban and somebody pointed it out to me, and then I did some research and I really wanted to set a novel there, but I didn't want to write a novel that was about the suffering of women. Although that is a theme that is important to me, it didn't feel like that was enough of a story. And it wasn't until I realized that it could be about an uprising, i.e. a revolution, that I felt that this is a story that I really wanted to tell. So the title came from my desire to represent a revolution. And I'm fascinated by revolutions. I'm deeply committed to the idea of protest as a main engine for human progress. So when I realized it could be about not a static story of suffering, but rather an energetic movement of liberation, that's really when I got excited about the idea, and that was really the impetus for writing the novel and for the title. And I know people think it's about July, but it does touch on July, but it's not about the July uprising.
I think when the title first started floating around the internet, that was the general perception that this is about the July uprising. But I went in knowing that this is not about it. For me, it was the opposite. It was a pleasant surprise that Kushum was part of the uprising.
Yeah.
And Kushum reminded me of some of the voices that we have heard during the uprising, the very same voices who were eventually sidelined, marginalized, and not allowed to take up space when they needed women's bodies to shelter them and to stand in front of a line of fire. They used those bodies, but eventually they didn't. Kushum represented that, and her sister represented the 1,500 that were killed in July 20.
That's right.
That was a beautiful homage, I felt, to the uprising, and it linked a contemporary Bangladeshi moment to a tale as old as time itself, which is legalized prostitution that is part of our national history. Yeah. Is there
Well, I was just going to say, Kushum is radicalized by July. You know, she is the daughter, she's a poor, she is like, compared to the women who are on Banishanta, she's relatively educated, but in the greater scheme of things, you know, her father sells fruit on the street. She went to school until class 5. She works as a cleaner in a garment factory, and she sees the July Revolution, and she's very curious, and she joins, and they start to get to know her because she has an amazing voice. So she sings. Correct. And she says to her sister, when I am running from the police and they're beating us, the policeman doesn't know if he's beating the legs of a rich girl or a poor girl. And I feel, and that is the sort of like power of a protest, is that on the street, everyone appears to be equal. And it's a sort of romanticized idea of what a protest is, and that sense of, that sense of equality is soon dashed by what happens to her sister, but at least for that moment. And so when she gets a taste of that, and she brings some of those ideas to the island when she eventually becomes the leader of that revolution.
I noticed that. I noticed that exact sentence where she says that no one recognizes whom the legs belong to originally. Because a lot has been said about the July uprising, and one of the strengths that we felt was present here on the grounds is it truly encapsulated the Bangladeshi dream of having a just society. It was an anti-discriminatory protest movement eventually, and every walks of life eventually did participate, even though it originally started as a public university student protest movement, which later ballooned into private university participation, and then everyone, from mothers to rickshawas to children who all wanted to be a part of that. And Kushum and her sister represented that in that. Beautifully captured. But I am curious now that you mentioned the class angle. Kushum also doesn't come from the Naxalite movement, for instance, was galvanized by President's University educated boys who went into the village and wanted to rescue them. This is a very different uprising story. This is a very different rebellion story. In many ways, it reminded me of slave rebellions, not that we have a lot of them, but there's one successful one, the one in Haiti, or other examples that we read in literature, including one by Edgar Allan Poe in a very strange short story. Now I can't remember the name. It's where the inmates of a mental asylum turn on their doctors and enslave the doctors and become the captors. Very fascinating story. In that way, the rebellion for me, in the story, in the uprising, Kushum brought in some of the city-centric or some of the urban ideologies that this particular participation in the Dhaka Uprising lent her.
Yeah.
But then Kushum is also not someone who's rescuing the girls in the sense that she's not a privileged person herself.
No.
That narrative choice, tell me a little more about it. Walk me through that. Because there is often I'm leaning into this question a bit because often there's a tendency to flatten the class landscape as the elite versus the proletariat, as the haves versus the have-nots. This is more layered and more complex than that, and I find that fascinating. Could you tell me a bit more about it?
So Kushum, at first, she thinks, oh, this must have been a mistake. I came to this island by mistake. My parents will rescue me. I don't belong here. And she kind of looks down at the women and she looks down at their children and she refuses to engage with them. It's only when she realizes that she is also them, that she is not being rescued, nobody's coming to save her, that she decides to put her energies towards escaping. And she realizes that she cannot escape alone. And in fact, at first, her revolution is quite selfish. She wants to get out and she knows she can't do it alone and she has to bring them with her. And because you see the story through the eyes of the children, you see the way that her thinking is changing, but through the eyes of the children, where they're saying, okay, and the children believe that she's Bon Bibi. They believe that she's been brought to rescue them, right? And she keeps resisting that narrative. She says, I'm not here to save you. I don't care about you. You're the children of whores. I don't care about you. So you don't want Kushum to be like a totally idealized kind of goddess figure. She has to go on a journey herself. And by the end of the story, she is at one with these women. And she isn't saving them, she's saving herself, but she believes in this idea of the collective. And she says, what happens to us, what happens to one of us happens to all of us. And that is fundamentally that moment when everything changes, is when everybody kind of realizes that. Oh, hold on. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, I just lost you for a second. You're back. Yeah, okay.
That was another remarkable turning point in the story for me. The strange feminist utopia after Amma leaves and Kushum becomes the de facto leader. The children go to school, they take afternoon naps, and the women start cleaning up, right?
Yeah.
And it's a different order. It's a different order of life without the men, without the oppression. It's softer, kinder, more built around solidarity, where they now get to know each other. They find out about where we're born, how old were you?
Yeah.
That reversal of the traditional codes of society, which even though this is a state of exception, the island functions on the theory of exception. It's a strange, I want to say, a strange space outside, one would think that outside the parameters of legality even, but then we later find out that it is very much legal. It is allowed to function in an extra legal way almost, outside the parameters of Bhadra society, like civil, respectable society. The flip book, the Kushum taking over and then reordering the order of things. Tell me what drew you to it. Is it very Sultana's dream of you?
Yes, it's 100% inspired by Sultana's dream. And it is inspired by all of our kind of ideas about what a feminist utopia would look like. And I don't want to romanticize a place like Bani Shanta. It is a place where the worst things that can happen to women do happen. But it is also a place that exists outside of like a shame narrative, okay? Because there are men on the island, there's no society. And one of the things that I explored was the women's freedom to say exactly what they mean. So there's no sense of propriety, right? All of the words, which is quite shocking to perhaps a reader like you or I, to be like, oh, this is language that, but I wanted to show that the things that hold us in a sense of like what is proper and what is permissible don't exist there. So that is already the world that they live in, even before Kushum creates a moment of utopia, which only exists very briefly. So it's already a kind of place of exceptionalism because it exists outside the bounds of society. In the brief moment when Kushum builds her kind of revolutionary ideal, which lasts only a very small amount of time, it's it's a fantasy. It's my fantasy. It's like, what would it be like to live on an island of women? And in the same way that Begum Rokia imagined that her world in Ladyland was very clean, it was full of flowers, there was like bird song, there was peace. We all have that dream. We all believe that if we were somehow to build a society in which women ruled, that those things would exist. And so I wanted, although the story is kind of quite dark and quite brutal, there is this moment where you catch a glimpse of what that world, or indeed the world, could look like if some of our fantasies came true. Yeah. And one of the things is like in fact in Sultana's dream, the way that they build this ideal society is through science. They do it through technology, right? And Kushum, the first thing she does when she gets money is she builds a tube well, because she wants everyone, and the memory of this water being so sweet is the thing that kind of brings this sense of joy and lightness to everybody. So again, this use of technology. So yeah, we owe so much to Begum Rokia, as feminists and as writers, and I think she's hugely underestimated. And that story really lives inside me, and there are so many ways in which this novel was inspired by Sultana's dream.
I'm so happy to hear you say that. In recent conversations, even within Bangladesh, I now hear even Begum Rokia Shaklat Hussein's brand of feminism, which was once championed in this part of the world as this is the ideal Muslim feminist narrative, that women should be educated, but they should also be respectable, and they should also not challenge the status quo too much. Even that is rejected. And so it's important that we remind ourselves of Sultana's ideals, of Begum Rokia's principles again and again, because we're going backwards again, right? Even those ideas are no longer accepted.
Yeah. I think she was a radical, though, because in Sultana's dream, the men were imprisoned. It was not like, let's be nice to them. It was like, they're good for nothing. Keep them sequestered. So I think that she was deeply far ahead of her time. And yes, even the sort of like forms of feminism that we had basically accepted were important. The things that built Bangladesh, women's education, women's access to information and to rights, all the things that my mother's generation fought for, things that were
in the political space.
Exactly.
Yes.
Things that were enshrined in our constitution, which for its time was a very progressive constitution.
Exactly.
Even those things are now being questioned. So this is why I feel energized by a sense of injustice and a sense of going backwards.
And yes, and to that point, the respectability politics around labeling Begum Rokia Shaklat Hussain as the respectable feminist scholar is also problematic, and it is just an attempt to pigeonhole her and not take into account the radicality she brought in her work. So I deeply admire that aspect, the wanting to see a world where women can rule. And what that looks like, however temporarily, however much of an exception it is. Speaking of exceptions, I have to be so appreciative of the way the women are referred to in the novel. The language politics, the linguistics politics of referring to fallen women or shamed women or bishas and magis and whores, however you want to refer to them, as simply our mothers is a radical choice. And I felt moved deeply by the children narrating the story and repeatedly, almost insistently, constantly referring to their mothers as our mothers, constantly referring to the women as our mothers. I want to know more about this choice. Why the collective pronoun? Why the storytelling from the children's perspective? And them referring to them as our mothers. That's how I will remember them. If I write a book, something on this book, I will refer to them as our mothers, as a collective body.
So thank you. So I think that, sometimes as a novelist, you make choices that are almost political, and then sometimes you make choices that are technical. And the reason that I chose to use the collective we is because I wanted to center the voices of the children, but also for a very precise reason, which is that as a reader, you don't want to live in the perspective of the women. It's too hard to live in the mind or the body of a person who is experiencing that kind of violence. So there are moments in the book when you go into the perspective of four of the sex workers on the island,
Yes.
and you hear their backstory. But for the most part, you're kind of watching, and those are the most difficult things in the book to read. But I really had to draw a fine line between a story that was not going to shy away from the brutal truths of what life on this island must be like, while also making it possible for the reader, because you can't write something that's impossible to read, that people will feel that they just have to put it down because they can't look at it, like kind of scorches their eyeballs. So there are moments when your eyeballs are scorched, and then there are other moments when you're slightly looking at it from a distance, and the children live on the island with their mothers, which I've seen myself. I've been to Bani Shanta. It's full of children. They know exactly what their mothers do. And yet, because they're children, they are not in those bodies. They are not having those experiences. And that's why I told that story. Now, in terms of the language, I was really careful when the women refer to each other, and often they're insulting each other. They say, oh, you're a whore, you're a bisha, you're a muggy. But when the children are referring to the women, they always call them our mothers. And they call it the work. They call it the work, right? Because in Bangla, people often say, আমি এই কাজটা যখন করি, বা আমি এই কাজটা করি. So I wanted that language to refer, to be from a slight remove from talking, from using perhaps the word like sex, or I don't think that it is sex. I think that it is work. And so there's all kinds of ways when you're talking about something that is as delicate, something that's difficult for people to really wrap their minds around. You have to use certain ways of making that palatable while also being like, this is the reality of the situation. And I think for these children, all they want is their mothers. That's all they want. They only want to see these women as their mothers. They want to be treated like children. And really the journey from the beginning of the story to the end is, how do these women go from seeing themselves as these bodies to be traded, to becoming mothers, to kind of humanizing themselves. And Kushum is the conduit. She's the one who makes that possible.
Thank you. That's beautifully put as well. You mentioned something about the four specific stories about four of the sex workers, harrowing stories, backstories, things that happened to them, how Amma became Amma, all of that. Did you worry about putting that kind of violence on paper? Did you worry about spectacularizing pain against the female flesh? There's a lot of that in fiction that deal with women's trauma.
Totally.
Did you worry about that? Did you want to both capture it and also remain aware of the politics of it?
For sure. I mean, that was one of the reasons that I didn't write the story for 15 years, because I didn't want to romanticize the story. I didn't want to create this kind of like narrative of suffering. It's really delicate, and only time will tell whether I was able to pull that off. I think that, as a writer, I feel a great sense of moral duty to tell stories that are uncomfortable and to show people parts of life, of human life, that exist simultaneous to our joy, that we have to hold. And it's almost impossible to hold the kind of range and extremeness of human suffering in your mind at all times as you're living your life. But that's why I read books. I read books so that I can feel things, including feeling uncomfortable, including feeling a deep sense of injustice. And I feel that it's my moral duty to tell those stories. And I feel a huge sense of purpose. So I can only speak to my intention. Now, whether a writer is able to pull off a kind of like nuanced and a story that allows these women to speak for themselves and to tell a story that is not just about their pain, but also about their joy and their pleasure and their revolution and their redemption, Only time will tell, but at least the intention was there. I can only
No,
speak to what I tried to do, not what I, that's all I can
I
do
think
is I
I think
try.
it's carefully, I would say thoughtfully, with a lot of, I would say, softness, and at the same time, not there's no fear in that portrayal,
Mhm.
even as the portrayal is harrowing. But there's softness to it. I felt that there's a delicateness with which such
Yeah.
difficult subject matter, such horrifying things that happen to these bodies, these women, these individuals, how it was portrayed. That it's that delicate balance, I think.
And in Bangladesh, weirdly, we're sort of like more used to hearing those stories because you read the newspaper and it's like this woman has been like some brutal thing has happened, very graphic. And I think that sense of like the violence that is being done to women is more on our minds. Or maybe it's just me, and my mother is a human rights, activist, and she's worked with some of the, so the stories are very present. My father's a journalist, so I'm very aware, right? So I have been getting a lot of messages from readers who have reached out to me and said, "Oh, I'm 1/3 of the way through your novel and it's really hurting me." And I'm like, "Okay, don't worry, it's gonna get better."
Mm.
She's like, I'm so much pain. I'm like, "It's
Context
okay.
really matters. I know.
It will
They're
get
supposed
better.
to be
It will
looking.
get better. By the end of it, you will not be in so much pain." So I'm trying to like hold people's hands through the story a little bit because I know it's not easy. It's not an easy read.
And I appreciate what you just mentioned about our context versus this book being read by
Yeah.
a global audience, right?
Yeah.
In my South Asian literature class, whenever we read even the classics like Ice Candy Man, My Bapsi Sidba, or Goddess Mountains by Arundhati Roy.
It's funny. Somebody asked me in an interview the other day, like, do you think that the form of patriarchy let's say in the context in which I wrote in Bangladesh, for instance, is different than forms of patriarchy in other parts of the world? And I was very reluctant to say yes to that question. I mean, I think there are things like, for instance, the legalization of child marriage or our unfair inheritance laws. There are some structural differences.
Sure.
But I think patriarchy exists in its most violent form in every society, in every generation since the dawn of time. And so I don't think there's a different quality. However, I do think that we have become almost like capable of talking about violence in a way. And I think that actually it's a good thing, because when I talk to young feminists or young women in the West, that they don't really see the need for feminism as much. Whereas in a place like Bangladesh, we know exactly what we have to do because we can see these different forms of violence that are being enacted every day. So I don't think that we, in total terms, live in a more patriarchal society than anyone else. I do think, however, that in our literature, in our journalism, in our politics, in our policymaking, like these issues are at the front of our minds. And I think that's possibly why we've come as far as we have. And I want to see it as a good thing. But yes, there is a sense that when I'm talking to you about this story, you're going to understand that I'm talking about a thing that is not only extraordinary in its intensity, but also ubiquitous and also has been normalized. And I think going back to this issue of women and whether patriarchies differ, I think so much of it has to do with poverty. Women suffer the brunt of poverty. So whatever is happening on a larger scale in society, it will be worse for women. Women will bear the sort of social, political, and economic consequences of poverty, of infrastructural poverty, of the expendability of bodies, of medical negligence, of the inaccessibility of healthcare, all of those things.
All of that. And that's why when Kushum educates everyone about the system and how passionate she becomes when she goes off on one of her rants about the system, I was kind of screaming with her, yes, it is the system. It is, and we have to fight the system. It's larger, it's bigger than just us, it's bigger than just the island.
Yeah.
Stylistically, since we're spending a lot of time talking about themes, and I can see that we can go on and on, such a fun, I know that's a strange word to use for a novel with such severe, serious theme, but such a fun, I what's another word I'm looking for? Breezy. Short chapters, extremely readable, told from different characters' perspective, and surprisingly, for such a serious subject matter, this is an unputdownable novel. I read it in 2 sittings. I
I
started
just
last
said
night.
yesterday, so I appreciate your commitment.
208 pages or something to that effect. And it was an easy, breezy read. I'm so sorry I'm saying that. I don't mean it in a way that the subject matter is easy, but the style, stylistically, how did you accomplish that?
Well, thank you for saying that. And it's funny because writers, like if you create like a hierarchy of compliments that you can give to a writer, I think like page turner is really one of the top ones, because you can write the most kind of like important and worthy subject, but if you don't get your reader to turn the page and to really deeply care about what happens next, then you failed. Your characters can be like the most charismatic, interesting people in the world, but if you don't get the reader to turn the page, you're nowhere. You're not even like at the beginning of the meal. So I think that it's just one of those things where whatever it is that I was trying to say had to be delivered in a way that would make people really care. And my job is to make you care. My job is to hold your beating heart in my hand. And I've spent 20 years trying to figure out how to do that. So, and it's still a journey. Every time I open the computer and I'm trying to write something new, I'm like, how am I going to make people care about this? And it's only when I deeply care about something. And in fact, the sort of backstory to this novel is that my publishers were expecting a completely different book from me, because I had written The Startup Wife in a sort of comedic vein. And I thought, oh, I'm just gonna write some more jokes and I'll write another funny novel. And I
That was
promised
really
book.
funny. That was that's one of my favorites of yours. Although this is now my favorite, but I found The Startup Wife so funny, so dry, the humor.
So I promised them this other book, and so we did the book deal, and then they took me out for a little celebration, and they're like, we just want the bookshop owners keep telling us we just want happy stories. We just, the world is so dark. And I was like, inside I was like, oh no, what have I done? Because almost the week that book was due to the publisher, I sent them this other book. And I said, look, I'm really sorry, but this is the story that I had to tell. And to their credit, they really embraced it and they really got behind it. But it was because I really wanted to tell the story. It just came from my blood and guts. And so when you really care about something, it's then easier to convey that sense of urgency to your reader.
Beautiful. Beautifully said. And this is something I'm going to ask more generally for our readers and also for the emerging writers who probably want to know more from you. Those that follow our page, those that read our content, those that publish with us, they want to know more about this particular process, the process of writing, making your reader care about the subject matter you care about, something that may seem earth-shatteringly important to you, but it may not come across as important to the readership. How does that work? How does one find their true calling and be able to express that, articulate that to the wider audience? What's the trick? Is there a trick?
Well, there's no trick. I would just say that, so I'm judging the BBC National Short Story Prize this year.
Amazing. Congratulations.
And thank you. It requires me to read many stories. And I would say that when I read a short story, that is the difference between one in which I'm reading a perfectly pleasant story that's well told, but I just don't care about it at the end, versus something that really grips me. It's because the writer has chosen to find the deeply specific thing that they want to say. So it's not like a general story of growing up or a general story of like, the way you feel about your childhood or your parents. It's like a very specific story. It's like, this one thing that is so particular that only this human could have experienced it. And I think sometimes when writers start out, they they don't have the confidence to focus on that specificity and to say, okay, this is like the tiny, tiny detail that I'm going to tell that everything is going to sprout from. So I think there's no trick, but I would say to a writer who's starting out, find something really, really tiny, a really small detail about a person's life, about their story that you really care about, and go from there. And resist the urge to kind of generalize.
Do you also feel that the specificity, if it is so specific, and if the author is unable to make the reader care about the specific, that can potentially deter a reader from engaging with the text? I guess what I'm asking is, the specific must also appeal to some kind of generality, doesn't it?
It does, but you can't think about that. Like, I think people think too much about that. So I think I think that there should be a story that only you can tell, that no one in the world can tell the story but you, about something that only you know about. And then people will care about it. Like, 20 years ago, I did a master's in creative writing, and I was in a room with 10 other, it was a really small class. And the only difference between me and all those people was that I had a story that I really, really wanted to tell. And the thing about Bangladesh, and I'm speaking to the Bangladeshi people who read our page and who care about your page and want to be writers, there are like a million stories in Bangladesh. It is like a place full of stories. And the reason is that like there's something about there's just something about being in a society that is really on the cusp of tremendous change, that has a huge number of things happening at the same time, that you can really find. I challenge you to find like stories that like are really deeply specific. And so don't worry about, are people going to care about this? Like, people will care about it. You have to care about it. And don't think about an audience, just think about the one story that only you can tell, and tell that story.
I appreciate that. I'm sure our readers are going to appreciate that as well. Do you feel your own writing has become more specific with your fifth book?
I think my writing has become like more unapologetic. And I think that's what happens to people as they get older. They just are who they are, you know? And so when I turned in this book, I was like, maybe no one will want to read this, because it's about a revolution literally on an island of 100 people in a place that most people have never been to. Who cares, right? But that was the story that I had to tell. And so I just said, well, even if nobody reads it, I'm still going to write the story. And then instead of thinking of the end goal, which is like, who's going to read it, who's going to publish it, who's going to like it, none of those things were in my mind. And I think that is possibly like one of the great beauties of getting older, which is that you have a more of a clear sense of who you are. And that means as a person, but it also means as a writer.
Absolutely. In academic circles, we all like to joke that the second book is where you sound like yourself. The first book is where you're still trying to impress people, and you're trying to show that I belong here. I have done my homework. I know them all.
Yes,
please let me
it's true. Yes,
and the second book is where you sound like yourself.
I have a question for you, because you've read the book. You're probably the only person in Bangladesh other than my dad who has read Uprising.
I am so privileged.
Do you think that it's going to be controversial?
No, I don't think so. Because at its core, it is a story of women, a group of women and children, banding together to overthrow an oppressive system and choosing a life for themselves where they can live a full human life. That's the story.
Thank you. You don't think people will be disgusted by some of the things that they read in it?
Let them be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's okay. And I think, I think it's okay to be disgusted. I think it's okay to be uncomfortable. And I really didn't want to shy away from that. In fact, I found it quite exhilarating, because there are things that Kushum and her, fellow workers
yeah.
on the can say that I couldn't say out loud. And one of the beauties of being a writer is you can be a ventriloquist. So like all of the things the way that they speak is so far from the way I would ever allow myself to speak that I find it quite pleasurable to get to do that.
And liberating, I would say.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. Yeah.
I can see myself teaching this and scandalizing some of my students. But then I would want to do that. You're a university kid. You should.
Right.
You should be able to confront the realities of life. Yes. Let people be slightly scandalized and offended. I think you're enjoying it. I think you would enjoy the backlash if there is any.
We'll see. We'll see.
We'll see. I have one more question.
Okay.
The rebellion, the uprising. I know the word enslaved was used in the text because the women were enslaved, and Amma's character, who reminded me once again of the overseer figure in slave narratives. She's not the master. The master is someone else, but then she executes the master's orders. Also a victim of the system herself, but has become someone who benefits from it, someone who ties off the power that was once denied to her. So she has a very complex relationship with power and sexuality herself. Given this complex ecosystem that you've created in this text, that the oppressor is a woman, the individuals being oppressed are women, the rescuer is a woman, and at the end of the story, it is the oppressor and the rescuer who are spoiler.
Yeah, don't give it away.
No spoilers. So by the time the story ends and the way we leave the story, this very complex narrative of women's agency, autonomy, women's own oppressive ability, and women withstanding harsh conditions and wanting to rise above themselves. How do we take that lesson? I don't know if apply is the right word, but how do we take that lesson and apply it to our real lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I put a lot of thought into that. And I think the answer is it's the system. So Amma is as much a product of the patriarchy as she is creating the system. And when you see her backstory, you see how she was produced by the system, and she becomes its tool. She becomes its manifestation. And I don't want to shy away from that. I don't want to create a sort of narrative which is like men are doing all the oppressing and women are doing all the victimhood. We exist in these circular, teleological, and like eternal cycles of violence that are mostly perpetrated on the bodies of women. But it doesn't mean that the men are doing all the violence. It means that we are trapped in the system that makes it almost impossible for anyone to break free. And it also makes it possible for women themselves to be the oppressors. And I had this interesting experience the other day when a woman came up to me after hearing me speak, and she said, I was, abused by my mother-in-law. And I thought, well, I haven't told a story about a mother-in-law or about families at all. This is a world in which there are no families. And yet she really read it that way. She read it as like, who is the madam? Who is the amma? And in her world, it was her mother-in-law. And she talked to me about how, the woman who is supposed to be the woman is the one who is like the sharp end of the patriarchy. It's not the father-in-law. He's a kind of benign figure in the background. And we see that in so many novels and in so many real narratives. And so I think we really need to think about it as a kind of systemic violence that is sometimes perpetrated by men, often, but also sometimes perpetrated by women.
That was important. I felt that. That's an important and conscious choice I felt made by you, that the perpetrator here is a woman. And again, it might take us back to the July 24 uprising as well.
Sure.
When we think of, female leaders, there is always that additional layer of expectation from female leaders that they are going to be X, Y, and Z, and then there is a harsh critique when they're not X, Y, and Z. And both of those arguments are true, that female leaders can be just as corrupt as male leaders on one hand. On the other hand, female leaders are judged possibly twice as harshly on account of their gender. So both of those things, both of those truths are true. And I feel that in the novel, that tension comes out really naturally, because the children and the mothers do have a kind of kinship relationship with Amma, even as Amma is their monster.
Yeah,
she
absolutely.
She is the monster that has trapped them into this cage.
Yes. And when and they miss her, they feel responsible for her. They feel like the world is going to fall apart when she's not there. I mean, they are trapped in a kind of deeply sort of like, cyclical kind of relationship with her. They're trapped in a kind of codependency with her.
Yeah, definitely. I genuinely enjoyed getting to know the characters. The children, for me, were such a source of positivity and joy in a text that can be bleak and hard at times. And as I said, I didn't put it down since I picked it up last night. I just went to sleep and then woke up and started again. And I think it's the children that sustained me as I read through them. Kushum is a brilliant vehicle through which the narrative unfolds, but I felt that the children sustained the lifeblood of the story for me as a reader. And I thank you for that. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Nazia. You asked such great questions, and I really, really enjoyed our conversation, and I felt deeply seen. So I really, really thank you.